Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? One that really kind of reshaped America?
Yeah, this one's huge, definitely.
It is. We're looking at the legacy of Earl Warren and, the Supreme Court during his time. Basically, we'll be using the American History Tellers podcast on Supreme Court landmarks, that one,
Mhm.
as our kind of our guide.
Right. Yeah, that series is really good.
Yeah, it is very informative. And so the Warren Court is fascinating because they took on cases that weren't just like about laws. They were about like the fabric of America. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's about so much more than just like legal technicalities.
Exactly. So we're talking Brown v. Board of Education, Miranda rights, even rulings on contraception. These weren't just like decisions in a courtroom. They change how we think, how
Mhm.
we live, even today.
For sure. So today I think it's important to not just go over like what they decided,
Right.
but really like why it matters, even now.
Yes, exactly. Like, why should we care? So to really understand it, we need to look at everything.
It's true. The context, like the time the personalities involved,
Right.
the ripple effect of it all.
Yeah. Like how a court can actually, drive social change.
Exactly. It's a powerful thing.
It is. It is. Okay. So let's start at the beginning with Earl Warren himself. Before he was Chief Justice, he was the governor of California,
Mhm.
and everyone thought he was like this safe, moderate pick, for Eisenhower.
Right. Like a pretty standard choice.
Yeah. But there's this story about his transition, from governor to Chief Justice. It's kind of a glimpse of the man.
Mhm.
It's 1953, and this young reporter is interviewing him in the backyard of the governor's mansion, no less. And he asks him about, like, getting that call from Eisenhower, offering him the job.
I love these little behind the scenes stories.
They're great. And Warren jokes that he was in the shower and his wife almost told the secretary to call back. Like, so casual, right?
You just sound pretty relaxed.
He does. Like,
Yeah.
even playful. But then the conversation, like, shifts. They start talking about Brown v. Board of Education, which is already huge.
Oh, absolutely. School segregation was such a massive issue.
And the reporter's sensing this shift in the court. Like, they're not going to just sit back anymore. So he asks Warren about people who see the court as, like, snuck in its ways, slow to act on civil rights.
Oh, I bet that was a loaded question.
It was. And Warren says, I'd say those people know a lot of 10-cent words, which I love.
That's a good one.
Right. But then get this, off the record, he says, the Supreme Court is as active or inactive as the justices who sit on it.
Wow. Talk about foreshadowing.
Right. It's like he's hinting at what's to come.
Totally. Like he understood the power he had.
Right. The power to shape society, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Okay, so let's dive into the case that really put the Warren Court, on the map. Brown v. Board of Education. So picture America in 1953. Segregation is everywhere. It's a law of the land, protected by that separate but equal idea from Plessy v. Ferguson decades earlier.
It's hard to even imagine now, right?
It is. And black students were denied a decent education simply because of their race.
And think about the psychological impact of that. The message it sends, the opportunities it denies. It's just heartbreaking.
It is. And the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall,
Amazing, man.
he was incredible, determined to fight this, And they built such a powerful case.
They really did.
And one piece of evidence that just stands out is the Kenneth Clark doll study. You familiar with that one?
Oh, yeah, it's powerful.
It is. They showed black children dolls of different races, and it revealed so much about how segregation was damaging their self-worth. Many of them associated negative traits with the black dolls. Some even preferred the white dolls. It's so telling.
Absolutely. It just shows how deeply ingrained the prejudice was.
And it makes you think, like, how does something like segregation affect kids on that deep level?
Right. It's not just about physical separation.
And it's about the messages it sends,
Yeah.
about worth and belonging. And those effects can linger for generations.
For sure. That kind of trauma can be really lasting.
Absolutely. So this study was key in showing that separate was inherently unequal.
Right. It wasn't just about facilities. It was about the whole system.
Yeah, exactly. But even with this powerful evidence, Warren was facing a divided court.
Oh, I bet. This wasn't an easy decision.
No. And you've got legal precedent favoring segregation and the potential for massive backlash. It's a lot of pressure.
I can't even imagine to be in his shoes at that time.
But Warren, he's determined to get a unanimous decision. There's a story about him having lunch with Justice Stanley Reed, like over and over again.
Really?
Yeah, because Reed was hesitant to overturn Plessy.
Oh, I see.
And Warren just wouldn't give up until he convinced him.
Wow. That's some serious dedication.
I know, right? He was persistent.
He was. He really believed in this.
He did. So finally, in 1954, they deliver the decision. Unanimous, segregation in public schools. Unconstitutional.
A landmark rule.
It was. And Warren's words are so powerful. He says, to separate black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Like, he got it. He understood the damage it caused.
Yeah. It wasn't just an abstract legal issue for him.
No, it was about real people, real kids. Okay, so huge victory, right? But the fight is far from over. Even President Eisenhower's initial response is surprisingly lukewarm.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, and then you have the resistance, especially in the South.
Of course.
I mean, think about Little Rock, Arkansas. Federal troops facing off against the state's governor over integrating Central High School. The nation's divided. And
Yeah.
Brown v. Board, it's a flashpoint.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? It's not just about changing the laws. It's about how those changes play out in the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, how does a court decision, even one as big as Brown v. Board, actually lead to change? Out there in the real world, it's not automatic, is it?
Right, it's not like flipping a switch.
Exactly. It takes so much more than just like a ruling. It takes effort, political will, and people who are brave enough to stand up and say no more.
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely. People putting their lives on the line, really.
Yeah, it really shows the limits of what a court can do on its own right. Like, they can make a decision, but then what?
Right. They need people to actually enforce it to make it real.
For sure. Okay, but on that note of the court's power to create change, let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's talk about fair representation. Voting rights.
A big one.
Huge. It's easy to think that one person, one vote is just like a given right. Like, it's always been that way.
Right. Seems obvious.
But back then, the system was a mess. It was set up to give more power to rural areas, which meant urban voters, they had way less power.
Really? It was that unbalanced.
Oh, yeah. Like, imagine your vote being worth only a fraction of someone else's, just because of where you live. Crazy, right?
That's wild. No wonder they had to step in.
They did. The Warren Court comes in and says, nope, not going to fly. We're talking Baker v. Carr, Gray v. Sanders, Reynolds v. Sims, all huge rulings.
Yeah, I've heard of those. They established that one person, one vote idea, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They forced states to redraw their districts so everyone's vote counted equally.
Yeah.
And that's huge. It's fundamental to how our democracy works, even today.
It's amazing to think how one court can have that kind of impact. Like, their decisions shape the way we vote even now.
It's true. And it shows how the Warren Court wasn't afraid to, expand civil liberties. They moved away from that hands-off approach that some courts take.
Yeah. Less about just interpreting the law, more about actually shaping a better society.
Right. Using their power to make a difference. And it's not just about voting rights either. They also protected the rights of people accused of crimes. Like, in a big way.
Oh, yeah. I bet I know where you're going with this. Miranda rights, right?
You got it. Miranda v. Arizona. It's a classic case. Shows how the court wanted to make sure everyone, no matter what, gets a fair shake.
Innocent until proven guilty and all that.
Exactly. So let's recap for a sec. Ernesto Miranda accused of a serious crime. But they never told him he could stay silent or have a lawyer.
That doesn't seem right.
Not at all. And he confessed. But then his lawyer argues, hold on, this wasn't a freely given confession.
I see, because he didn't know his rights.
Exactly. In this case, it just exposed this huge power imbalance, right, between regular people and the police.
Makes sense, especially back then.
Oh, yeah. Before Miranda, there were tons of these coerced confession cases, sometimes through threats or even violence, awful stuff.
So the court saw that and thought, okay, we need to protect people.
Right. Give them some tools, some knowledge you know.
And that's where the Miranda warning comes in. You know it. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Like, we've all heard it a million times.
It's practically part of our culture at this point.
Right. It is. But it's easy to forget how groundbreaking it was.
Think about it. It's this simple warning. But it completely changed how police interact with suspects.
Leveled the playing field a bit.
Yeah. It made sure everyone knew their rights from the moment they're arrested.
So important. And it really shows how dedicated the Warren Court was to fairness.
Yeah.
To justice.
Yeah.
Even for people accused of crime.
For sure. They weren't just about protecting the good guys.
Right. They were about protecting everyone's rights. Period.
Okay, so we've talked about some big ones, Brown v. Board, Miranda. But we can't forget about Griswold v. Connecticut. This one was huge, too.
Oh, yeah. This one was about contraception.
Such a sensitive issue, especially back then.
Definitely. And it might seem less dramatic than, like, Brown or Miranda, but it's super important because it's about individual liberty, about personal choices.
Right. Like, what right does the government have to tell people what they can and can't do in their own homes? Exactly. And specifically in this case, it was about a Connecticut law that banned contraceptives. Can you believe that?
That's crazy. And the people who challenged this law were amazing. Estelle Griswold and Dr. Seeley Buxton. So brave.
Yeah, they really put themselves out there.
They did. They opened a clinic to provide contraceptive advice knowing they could get arrested, which they did. It was like a deliberate act of defiance.
Wow. Like, they were willing to be the test case.
They were, and it shows how personal this issue was for people. They saw this law as a huge invasion of privacy.
Absolutely. And the court agreed with them. They ruled that there's a right to privacy implied in the Constitution,
Yeah.
even though it's not explicitly stated.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Huge. It paved the way for so many future decisions on reproductive rights. It's about personal autonomy,
Yeah.
about choice.
Yeah, like it's your body, your life. You should get to decide these things.
Right. But of course, there were people who disagreed with the ruling. Some justices argued that the court was overstepping, engaging in judicial activism instead of just interpreting the law as it was written.
Right. That debate about the court's role is still going on today.
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant tension, Like, how far should the court go? Should they just stick to the letter of the law? Or can they look beyond that and consider the broader impact of their decisions?
Tough questions. And in this case, the Warren Court, they definitely pushed the boundaries. They found ways to protect individual rights, even when they weren't specifically spelled out in the Constitution.
Yeah, they're definitely not afraid to make bold moves. And not everyone was happy about it. There was growing opposition to what they were doing,
Yeah.
even from within the government itself.
It was a time of huge change, right? And change is never easy.
Yeah, it was a real turning point in so many ways, and not everyone was on board with the changes,
Yeah, and the Warren Court, I mean, they were often right in the middle of all that upheaval, weren't they?
They were.
Yeah.
Like, even when it came to free speech, especially during the Vietnam War. You remember Tinker v. Des Moines? The one where students wore armbands to protest the war?
Yeah, I remember that one. It was a big deal, wasn't it?
Yeah. Huge. It showed that the court was willing to protect even those unpopular opinions, even when it was controversial.
Yeah, it was a strong message about the First Amendment, right?
Definitely. But then there's this other case, United States v. O'Brien, where the court upheld the conviction of a guy who burned his draft card. So, where's the line?
Right, because that's symbolic speech, too, right?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a tricky one. Makes you think about the limits of even the broadest rights.
Yeah.
Like, when national security is at stake, things get murky.
So it's like they're saying, yeah, free speech is important,
But
yeah.
there are limits.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just shout fire in a crowded theater, right?
Yeah, there's that classic example.
Exactly. So it highlights this tension with judicial activism,
Mhm.
balancing those big principles with what's actually happening in the world.
So it's not always clear cut, is it?
Nope. And the Warren Court, they were always right there on that edge, pushing those boundaries, which is why people are still talking about them, arguing about their legacy and all that.
It was a bold approach, for sure. And speaking of risky moves, Warren himself kind of made a gamble near the end of his time as Chief Justice. And it didn't really work out the way he planned.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about when he decided to retire, right? Hoping that President Johnson would appoint someone who'd keep things going in the same direction.
Exactly. He wanted to make sure that the court, kept that activist spirit.
Right, because he knew how much impact the court could have. He'd seen it firsthand.
He had. And it seemed like a pretty safe bet at the time. But then Johnson's pick, Abe Fortas, ran into some trouble, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, there was that whole scandal, wasn't there? And in the end, the nomination failed, and then Nixon came in.
And that was pretty much the end of that, wasn't it?
It was. Nixon, well, he was a whole different story. Very conservative, He wanted justices who'd undo a lot of what the Warren Court had done, roll back those changes.
Right, he had a very different vision for the court.
He did. And he got his chance when he appointed Warren Burger as Chief Justice. That was a clear signal, wasn't it? Like, things were about to change.
Big time. It was a shift away from that whole judicial activism idea. But even the Burger Court had its surprises. Remember Roe v. Wade? Landmark decision on abortion rights.
Right. That came from a supposedly conservative court.
Exactly. So it just goes to show that you can't always predict how these things will go right.
Nope. Personalities change, ideologies shift, the world throws curveballs. It all plays a part.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into Earl Warren and his Supreme Court.
Wow, yeah, we covered a lot of ground, didn't we?
Yeah.
From segregation to voting rights to free speech to privacy. It's pretty amazing to think about the impact they had.
It really is. And their legacy. Well, that's still up for debate, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. Because some people see them as heroes,
Yeah.
you know,
Hmm.
champions of justice who made America a better place. But others, they think they overstepped their bounds, that they went too far too fast. It's complicated.
It is. But one thing's for sure. They left their mark on America. They expanded our understanding of individual rights and made the Supreme Court a much more powerful force in our society.
And they showed us that the law isn't just some abstract thing in a book, you know. It's a living, breathing thing. It's constantly evolving and changing. And it can be used to make a real difference in people's lives.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess the question is, as we face these new challenges in the 21st century, what kind of court do we want? One that just sticks to the old ways of doing things, or one that's willing to push the boundaries and fight for a more just and equitable world? It's something to think about, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating era in American history, we highly recommend checking out the American History Tellers podcast. Their episode on Supreme Court landmarks is a great place to start. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.